So this is our military room, typically the first stop on the upstairs tour. And this would have been a bedroom, part of the renovation in the late 1800s done by Mr. Smathers. So in this room, in the military room, we have exhibits of Haywood residents, both men and women, who participated in different military events starting in the Revolution and running up to the Vietnam War. So we have different displays around the room. We'll start with the Revolutionary era, where we have a picture of a tree that Jacob Shook would have walked by when he was on the Rutherford Trace. And then going chronologically, we have some materials from the Civil War, and then the Spanish-American War, where a regiment of local men were engaged in training for the war, but didn't actually fight in the war. We have some photographs of some of the boys who were on their way up to training for World War I. We show some pictures of them at their training camp up in New Jersey. Then we skip ahead to World War II and have some really interesting exhibit material from a nurse from Waynesville who trained here, finished her training in London, met her husband there, and then after the D-Day invasion, followed the troops as they went through Europe and treated all the soldiers, POWs, or anybody else that the nursing corps may have come across. We also have an exhibit of a couple of the brothers who are Smathers descendants who served in World War II, one in the European theater, one in the Pacific, one who survived, one who did not. We have an exhibit from the Korean War, or forgotten war, we often say, of the early 1950s, and some materials that one of our local boys brought home for his wife. And then we'll skip ahead to the Vietnam War, where one of our local residents put together a display about her son who was engaged in the Vietnam War and who unfortunately did not survive. Okay, so that's a display of the two brothers, Smathers descendants, Muse brothers, who served in World War II. The top was a pilot in the European theater, and he's the one who did not survive. And below him, Cecil Muse served in the Pacific in the Navy, and he did, and we have some letters that he wrote back home during the war. And down here we have what we call an escape map. It's made of silk, and it was given to all the pilots who flew over in missions in the European theater, so if they were shot down, they had means to figure out where they were and how to get back to the front lines. They also decided, why don't we see if we can help out our POWs? So during the war, any prisoner of war gifts that came in, usually from the Red Cross, usually included game boards like Monopoly. And they decided, well, if we slice open the Monopoly boards, we can slide in a map there. So if they were able to escape, they were able to find their way back to the front lines as well. A newspaper from the Waynesville Mountaineer shows after the victory in Asia over the Japanese, you see below the Jap surrender bold headline, the number of men that died during World War II from Haywood County. Wow. So these are the boots and the cape worn by Lieutenant Aileen Smith Varuska, the nurse that I talked about earlier, who trained here and in London and followed the troops through the course of the war, starting on the Normandy beaches and ending up in Germany. And along the way, she treated any of the soldiers who had fallen, been wounded, any POWs they came across, and even at one point, she and her fellow nurses were helping some of the prisoners from the Buchenwald concentration camp recover from their devastating experience. So Colonel Hanna, who led the regiment of Haywood troops during the Spanish-American War. Soon after the war, got married and wore this top hat that was made by the Knox Company of New York, who also made top hats for most of the presidents of the United States, from Abraham Lincoln up to Woodrow Wilson. So these are letters home from John Shook, who served in the regiment in the Spanish-American War, to his sweetheart back here in Haywood County. And we like to highlight that during our Valentine's open house sessions, where love letters like those from John Shook and others from Haywood soldiers back to their sweethearts at home. And we invite you to attend that in the spring, coming up each and every year. So this is a display, again, brought in by Wayne Snyder's mom several years ago, a display that she put together. Wayne Snyder from Waynesville, as soon as he turned 17 and enlisted in the Marines, went over to Vietnam. He had only been there a couple months before he was shot and wounded. And there's a shot of him in the hospital recuperating, showing off his Purple Heart. And then in the middle of the display is a letter home to Mom and Dad saying he's doing well, he's recovering, don't worry. If he's lucky, he'll even get to see a Bob Hope show. So he did indeed recover, but just a few months later, after he was sent back out into the war, he was shot and killed. Like they used to do back in the day, parents used to receive these telegrams announcing the death of their son or daughter in combat. So this is our industry room, another bedroom, part of the renovation in the 1890s by Mr. Smathers. And in this room, we like to highlight the different industries that have existed in Haywood County, starting with lumber mills and tanneries and moving up into the major industrial plants, mostly in the Hazelwood and Canton areas. So we'll talk a little bit more about those and how they may have affected the lives of those that lived here. But we will discuss a little bit more about the early industries starting in the 1850s, moving up to the early 1900s with the building of the Champion paper plant in Canton, then moving up to the 1940s where two major plants were built in Hazelwood, Dayco and Welco, adjoining each other, and then we'll talk about the demise of industry in the mid and the later 1900s in Haywood County. So things really kicked off in the mid 1800s with lumber mills because there was a variety of wood cutting opportunities in Haywood County. And if you can see the size of some of the trees that existed in the old growth in Haywood County before most of it was cut down later on, but these were then cut by the lumber mills and put a number of local men to work, but things picked up a little bit with the advent of the tannery and some of the smaller upholstery industries that took place in Hazelwood. And you can see some of the men who were employed at tanneries, some of those at the textile mills, and that's when things really started to pick up in terms of industrial growth in Western Carolina. At its peak, Western Carolina, Haywood County in particular, we had the highest number of plant workers in this part of the country. So at its peak, when things were really humming, the number of men and to a lesser extent women employed by industry in Haywood County put us in one of the top median earnings in the state of North Carolina. So in 1941, A.L. Friedlander, who owned Dayco Company up in Ohio, came down exploring for a place where he could build his plant in the south and landed on the Waynesville area in Haywood County, well, which is Hazelwood, which is now Waynesville. So he started building his rubber plant at that point. He also had become acquainted with a gentleman called Heinz Rollman, who owned a footwear company also up in Ohio, and he joined Mr. Freelander, and he built his Welco plant right around the corner from the Dayco plant in the Hazelwood area. He got his rubber products from the Dayco plant. Things were going really well, thousands of workers hired and employed at both plants starting in the 40s, but in the 1990s, both plants were closed. Dayco first, then Welco. And at that point, things really started to go downhill in terms of the industrial participation in Haywood County. For local residents who grew up here, I like to point out this drive-in that was located just outside of the Dayco plant, because a number of them remember attending that one of 3 drive-ins in Haywood County. And for those who still live or visit around the county over in Hazelwood area, the Dayco company plant has been replaced by the Walmart Center. Heinz Rollman escaped from Germany right before the beginning of World War II with his family, but he was so upset by the devastation that the World War caused, he came up with an idea of putting together an army of young people to spread the word of peace around the globe. And he thought that was such a great idea that he took his idea down to Congress, pitched it to some members of Congress in the early 1950s, and they said, nice idea, but no thank you. Yet, about 10 years later, when John Kennedy and his associate Sergeant Shriver, they came up with an idea of putting together an army of young people who spread the word of peace around the globe. They called it the Peace Corps. So in fact, Heinz Rollman was the idea man for the Peace Corps, and you can see that little certificate that he was given credit, although rather anonymously, well before JFK and Sergeant Shriver. So this trunk has some exhibits from the tourism efforts that have taken place. You can see the sign that used to go across Main Street in downtown Waynesville up until the 70s, but it was then taken down. But fortunately, just a couple of years ago, they put the same sign up, although it's now at the other end of the street, but it still announces us as the entry to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Champion Paper Company was started by Peter Thompson, another gentleman from Ohio who came down. Supposedly his son had attended a school in Asheville, so he was familiar with the area. But like the abundance of lumber for his plant, as well as the nearby water resource and a good labor supply. So he thought this was a great location for his paper plant, which he started building in 1906 and opened in 1908. In the early 20s, he sent his son-in-law, Reuben Robertson, down to supervise. He thought that was going to be a temporary assignment, but he ended up staying here, managing the plant into the 1960s. At its peak, it employed thousands of people. This was a coveted job for those working, living in the Haywood County area. They made a very good salary. There's a story that I've heard that before it closed a couple of years ago, that the average salary for a worker at the paper plant was in the $80,000 range, which for Haywood County is a very substantial salary. But early on in its history, they had sent out their lumber crews every morning, brought them back every night, sent them out every morning, and they decided, well, instead of wasting all this time in transportation, why don't we move our lumber crews out to where they were cutting the trees and set up shop there, and they can live there with their families. We'll put together a school and a store and make it a little community and let them work where they live. So they built a little town called Sunburst, and indeed for several years that's exactly what happened, until, if you can see the picture below, you can see all the trees had already been cut, plus they found out that they could use pine wood instead of the hardwoods from Haywood County, so they started cutting down and using pine from Georgia. No need for Sunburst. They raised the town, dammed the river, and that is now Lake Logan. During its heyday, the paper company had its own store. Mr. Robertson helped construct the local YMCA. The store was sort of unique for its time in that most Milltown stores, the employees were forced to shop there, but it was a voluntary stop for the champion workers during their employ at the paper mill. The company just a couple of years ago did shut down. They're still not sure what's going to happen to the site. It's a major environmental cleanup site, as well as being in a floodplain, so the future of the paper company is now up in the air. But at its peak in the 50s and 60s, the employees at the three major companies, Dayco, Welco, and Champion, employed probably about a third to a half of all Haywood residents. So we were the industrial base of Western Carolina. So if you took the downstairs tour, you would have heard about Jacob Shook and his brother being part of the Rutherford Trace in 1776, and that's a map of their path, starting down the mountain at Old Fort and going out west to around Murphy, North Carolina, and then circling back. And if you look closely, you'll see some numbered circles, and those are a few of the Indian settlements that they destroyed along that path. The boundary tree that you see in front of you on the riverside over near Bethel would have been marched by Jacob and the rest of the troops during the Rutherford Trace. And because they did march by that tree, which is still standing, although in not very good shape, we took a clipping from it several years ago and planted it in the backyard of the house, thereby making that connection between what Jacob Shook saw in 1706 and what you can see today as that connection between the boundary oak and what stands here now.
This room serves as a room where we talk about the communities of Haywood County, and also it serves as our resource room and library. Haywood County was not really, this area that is now Haywood County was not settled until after the American Revolution. At first it was part of Buncombe County, but in 1808 Haywood County was formed. At that time, the only real town in Haywood County was Waynesville or Mount Pleasant. Most people lived in or around small farming communities, but over time, industry moved in, which formed the town of Canton. The railroad brought us the town of Clyde, and tourism pretty much developed Maggie Valley. Today, when we think about Haywood County, it's not just Waynesville and Canton and Maggie and Clyde. There are a lot of smaller communities that add to the character of Haywood County. Communities like Crusoe, Fines Creek, Beaver Dam, Gibsontown, Cataloochee, even though Cataloochee is no longer an active community. We have taken artifacts from many of our communities to show just exactly what makes each community special. Some communities are still farming communities, others are part of the tourist industry, and others are bedroom communities for people who work elsewhere. So we try to look at each community, think about what's important there, and showcase that. We also have our library in this room. Our library is made up of books that are mainly from Haywood, about Haywood County, Western North Carolina, and the surrounding area. We use this as a resource for whenever visitors come and have questions, or if someone emails the Historical Society, we're able to come to our library and hopefully find the answer to their questions. We like using the library to educate ourselves also. A lot of the books have information that you can't find anywhere else, and so it's a valuable part of what makes the house special. This case is all about Canton. The showcase in here is the Canton Sanborn maps. These maps are from the first part of the 20th century. This one is from around 1920, and it's a great resource because we can look at the map and we can see what businesses and what houses were located where. It's important because so many of these businesses are no longer, and structures are no longer existing, especially along the Pigeon River. We have photographs of structures that still stand in Canton, like the Imperial Hotel, which is now the Southern Porch Restaurant. We have a team of oxen in front of the hotel. We have a shelf devoted to the town of Waynesville, which has always been the commercial center of Haywood County. A lot of the businesses in Waynesville that started around the turn of the century still have remnants of them today, and so we like to think about how Waynesville has grown from being a center for farmers to being the center of commerce for people today. We also remember our apple orchards in Sawnook. We still have Barber's Orchard there, who produces William Tell apples. The ledger from Bethel came from the Cathy store. The Cathy store and mill was located where the East Fork and the West Fork of the Pigeon River come together, and it was the most important commercial enterprise in that area. The ledger reads like a who's who of people in the Bethel community in the late 19th century. A lot of us have actually located some of our ancestors in that book who owed money to Mr. Cathy. Before it became part of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, Cataloochee was a very strong community. Today, residents like to go there to hike and to enjoy nature, and also people from outside the area go as part of the Haywood County experience. The people who lived in Cataloochee for over 100 years had to leave when the national park bought the property, and so many of them ended up living in Maggie, which was the closest large community nearby. Tobacco was a very important crop in Haywood County. A lot of people relied on it mainly for extras. There were very few people who really made their complete living from tobacco, but it became a really good side crop for people who wanted to save money to send their children to college, and so we can say that tobacco educated a lot of Haywood County kids. The posters on the wall actually were made at Western Carolina University as part of a project that the Historical Society did called Haywood County, a Portrait of a Mountain Community. If we have this book, which you can see matches the painting here that was done in 1895, and it has a lot of the photographs, a lot of which are in the collection at Western Carolina's Hunter Library. Our library is ever growing. We like to collect any book written by a Haywood County person, or written about Haywood County, or written about events, important events in Western North Carolina. We also enjoy reading about the culture of Haywood County in Western North Carolina. So we collected books by John Paris and also the Foxfire books. We collect family histories. Unfortunately, during the recent flood, a lot of our family histories were destroyed. They were stored in the visitor center, but we're trying to build those back. And we have a large collection of material just on Cataloochee. This is our women's room. It's the most original room in the house to the time that Jacob Shook built it. By looking at this room, you can get a better picture of what it looked like downstairs. The staircase going up is enclosed. The one downstairs would have been enclosed. The staircase comes up and into this room. The doors, two of the doors in this room are Georgian doors, like the one that was probably the front door of the house. The fireplace is all original, and we think that the one downstairs looked very much like this one. It has a wooden wall behind it, and it has an arched firebox. We think that originally this room did have a door to the outside, so there might have been a staircase outside or a small balcony. The windows were probably smaller, like the original one that was seen downstairs, so this room would have been quite dark. We call this the women's room because we want to highlight all the things that the women did. We talk a lot about Jacob and his sons building the house, but Isabella, his wife, and their daughters were busy maintaining the household, making the clothing, and working to feed and preserve the food. We're lucky because in the Smathers era of the house, sometime after 1860, Levi Smathers' mother, Mary Agner Smathers, moved into the house and spent her last years here. Because of that, she brought her things with her. When she died, her things were stored upstairs. Because of that, we have her 2 spinning wheels. We have her large walking wheel, which was used for wool and cotton, and we have her small linen wheel, which was used for flax production. We're also lucky that we have 3 pieces of Mary Agner's weaving. We have her an apron, we have a bag that she called her pocket, and we have a piece of woolen that was seen downstairs. Women worked hard until the technology brought about large changes in the way they worked. The biggest change was the sewing machine. Mary Agner probably didn't ever live to see a sewing machine, but her descendants definitely benefited from having the machine. It cut the sewing time in half, or by more than half, and by that time, cloth was available commercially. They didn't have to raise sheep and flax and cotton. They could just go to the nearest store and buy it. Before that time, though, cloth production was very labor intensive. You had to grow the fiber, you had to process the fiber, you had to weave it, and then you had to sew it. So it was a real blessing for women when they were no longer held to using a spinning wheel and all these accoutrements. We also, Haywood County has a good tradition of quilt making. We're lucky here at the Museum of Haywood County History. We have a quilt that was actually made in this room by Mary Smathers Morgan and her church ladies at Louisa Chapel Church. It's hanging on the wall, and the church women, her friends, would over a year save all their little scraps, cut them into squares, and then they would gather in this room to piece and then quilt a quilt. According to Mary's daughter, it was probably the last quilt made in the house. We also have another quilt, a little bit fancier, made by 3 generations of the Osborne family in Crusoe. This tool's called a weasel, and it was used to measure the yarn after it came off the spinning wheel. You turn it 40 times and then it pops, makes a popping sound, and that, when the weasel pops, you know you've got a certain amount of yardage in your yarn. This wheel, this large wheel, was used to spin wool and cotton. It's called a walking wheel, and it was attached with a cord to the spindle. The spindle would turn, and the yarn would accumulate on the spindle. This instrument is important because it belonged to Mary Agner Smathers. And we also have 2 examples of her weaving. These 2 pieces were found in the attic. It was confirmed by her descendants that these belonged to Mary Agner. Here we have a display of the different stages of production in actually producing the textiles. We have wool and flax which makes linen, and also samples of the types of natural dyes that early settlers in Haywood County would have used. This smaller wheel is called a flax wheel. It too belonged to Mary Agner Smathers. When she died in 1868, the 2 wheels, along with a lot of her textiles, were stored in the attic, and that's why we are lucky enough to have those today. The 2 samples of linen that we have of hers were probably actually spun on this wheel. Mary Smathers Morgan often had quilting parties in this room, in which ladies from her church, Louisa Chapel Methodist, would collect their scraps, and then they would gather here, sew the scraps into a large piece, and then quilt it. The quilt was then donated to a needy family. But Haywood County has a long tradition of quilt making. Quilts were made all over by family members for their own use. This quilt was made by 3 generations of the Osborne family in the Crusoe community. This quilt was made around 1920. Mary Agner didn't live long enough to actually be able to take advantage of the great invention for women of the 19th century, the sewing machine. The sewing machine really cut women's labor time to a large degree. Work that took hours and hours can now be accomplished in just minutes. Because of that, women were able to turn to fancy work, like the red work example you see there. Women's lives changed tremendously around the turn of the 20th century. Not only was their workload diminished by technology like the sewing machine, but attitudes toward what women were allowed to do were also changing. A side saddle that was ridden by a Haywood County woman around 1880. At that time, young women were expected always to ride side saddle when they were in mixed company especially. But by 1915, a new invention came along called the riding skirt. It's actually pants, but it looks like a skirt. And it really revolutionized the way women were allowed to ride on their horse. They could now ride astride. And so it showed the progress that women in Haywood County were making coming into the modern age.
So this display here we decided to create because when the settlers first came into this area, they did not obviously have doctors or any type of medical equipment. And the women of the families are the ones who actually took care of anything that might happen, including broken bones, colds, fevers, anything like that. The women would use roots and different leaves of trees and plants that they planted to create teas and tinctures to actually take care of the family. So that's how it was initially, and then as time moved on, we had doctors in the area that were not educated here but educated at Duke University. They came in the early 1920s, and that's when we actually had our first doctors here. They typically would either walk in to wherever they needed to go or go in on horseback, and they would use the saddlebag as something to hold their equipment. And then as time moved on again, they started using horse and buggy. That was a big help. And then one of the doctors, Doctor of the Stringfield family, actually used the train trestle and powered his way up towards anywhere where the railroad went. So that was very interesting to find out that history, and we actually have a good picture of that. Another thing that's changed over time is the equipment itself. We have here just showing surgical headlamps and how well they actually thought that through, and we use still something similar today. And here we have different syringes and how that's changed. There's really good pictures here of a modern day syringe as opposed to one back in the early 1900s. And this equipment here was actually made to, when people had fluid in their lungs or infection in their lungs, they would actually aspirate that out from the outside to the inside, and they would put a needle down into the lung and draw out whatever fluid or whatever infection that they found, which typically created more infection back then. So that's that. And then we had medical books. Originally, some of those are really early, in the 1920s, 1930s. Then we also had, early on, we had equipment that was used for eyes, ears, and throat. And that's all of this area here. And then we actually they did very primitive spinal taps back then, and they would put needles in the spine back then. That also created a lot of problems after the fact. Then in the 1870s to early 1900s, they would have pharmacies that would use different colored bottles for different types of medications, depending on how poisonous they might be. Back then, they actually used carbolic acid, they used opium and arsenic, just to name a few, that was actually used. And sometimes today, even some of the poisonous things are used at very small minimum amounts. And then moving on, we have a display of different pieces of medical equipment that was back in the 1950s. And these are along the floor here. This piece here is, if anyone knows what a TENS unit is, current, modern day, they're very small, and you can dial in electricity and you'll put electrodes on the muscle that needs to be worked on, or the area that needs to be worked on, and you dial in the electricity, just like this one, which looks big and scary, but nowadays they're just really small. And that's how that has changed over the years. This one here that's in the middle is a transcutaneous Doppler, and that's also a big machine that looks scary, but nowadays it's also very small. A modern day one is actually connected to a stethoscope, and you place that over a vein or artery that you need to try to hear, that's a good ways from the heart, and that's typically in the feet or the lower legs, and we're trying to find arterial sounds, and that's what that is. That's what the Doppler looked like then, but modern day is also in the palm of your hand. Here's the face of an X-ray machine that shows all the dials and the needles that how they use that, and that's also scary for using radiology back then. And here are the gloves. These are lead-lined gloves that were used then, and here is another piece of equipment there. That is also from the big one there. This one was in the 1960s, and that was 1950s. You can see how rapidly it grew smaller. So, and then modern days, of course, in your hand. Have anything in this county as a hospital until 1917. And that was actually developed by Champion, which was the largest employer then in the early 1900s. And what happened was there was a typhoid outbreak in 1918. So they developed that for the employees of Champion to use when they became very sick. So that actually operated, and you can see the picture of it there, and that was in Canton. And that operated until 1922, when actually that hospital became too small, and the population, the sick that needed medical attention in a hospital, outgrew this hospital. We started out with walking to patients' homes, and then on horseback, and then horse and buggy, and then using the train trestle, and then it finally evolved to the doctors who actually had offices in Canton and Clyde and Waynesville. We have several of those doctors that actually people would begin to go to their office instead of them coming to their home. So it grew fairly rapidly at that point, and we had several doctors over between the 1930s and the 1960s. It grew rapidly. An ambulance service was developed, and it was actually here in Haywood County, one of the first counties in the United States to have a paramedic service. And that was actually developed by an emergency room physician, and he felt like we needed something like that, and it was due to one big thing that happened. And this was a little girl who actually probably would have survived falling into a river, and that was actually Richland Creek. If she had had transportation then, she may have survived that drowning, but she did not, and she did pass. But at that point, it felt like in this community, in this county, it's very mountainous, so there's a lot of valleys, and it would be easier if we had transportation to go to wherever an accident might be or someone who's very ill. So that's the first ambulance services, and the first vehicle they actually used hearses. And I'm sure you've seen pictures of that on TV and such, that the hearses were used first, and then they used the van, and then now they have the big box vans for ambulance services that would have the paramedics. And it's almost the big ambulances with paramedic service. They have everything in that truck that would be needed in an ER. I mean, ER, they would have almost everything in that truck that someone would need that would be going to an ER, so they can get them there quickly and actually start treating them as if it was a mobile ER. And then that actually developed to the helicopter service here. And that began in Asheville with one helicopter, and that started in 1987 in September, and we started the service with the helicopter, and that was the helicopter could travel 300 miles in a straight direction, or a radius of 150 miles. And using the helicopter changed things drastically, because obviously the ambulances in the box trucks, they could get from valley to valley, but it would take a long time because you had to go around the mountains or go up and over a mountain. And especially in the wintertime, it was very difficult, but the ambulance took that away. And so now the helicopter can get from place to place much, much quicker, and get anyone who's injured or medically ill to a hospital very quickly. That shows the difference in the transportation, and actually There's good pictures here of the helicopter and pictures of the inside of the helicopter and the equipment, and you can see everything in there is everything out of an emergency room. And the helicopter also carries specialized medications, and they carry blood and blood products for anyone who might need that. And here's an example of the helmet. That's the helmet that one of the crew members would use in that aircraft. Still had a need for the hospital, but we needed one that was bigger. So the one that they decided to use had been a hotel, and that was the Bonnie Castle Hotel, and that was over on Pigeon Street in Waynesville, not too far from the Shelton House. So they used that hotel. Hotel as a hospital for some time, and then in the 1940s, they built the old Haywood County Hospital, which is still standing. They used that for a good while, that probably up into the 70s when they started building the current hospital that we use. This hospital, the old Haywood County Hospital, is now apartments. It became the Board of Education building after they no longer used that hospital. And then they decided to use it as apartments and condominiums.
Uniforms that were donated from the various military interventions throughout the world, starting up here with our Vietnam Command Master Sergeant Jackson, serving in Vietnam. We have another wearing his Eisenhower jacket during World War II. A full uniform from World War I, showing the leggings as well as his jacket. That's Colonel Hanna's jacket from the Spanish-American War. And then finally, at the base of the steps, we have a uniform worn by one who is involved in Civil War reenactments, showing his North Carolina regimental outfit that all soldiers in the North Carolina regiments were issued during the Civil War on the side of the Confederacy.
In the hallway upstairs is all about children. We realized several months ago that we didn't have anything in the house that was about children. So several months ago we had someone that donated, they started donating the crib and the doll that's in the crib here. And then we ended up with several pieces of clothing, and that's just representative of what the children wore back in the early 1900s. We have several pictures. Some of the pictures we know who they are. Some are just donated, and they're just children that were part of this county.
This is the chapel that Jacob built when he built the house, and it has always been used as a holy place. The story is that Jacob was working in his field, and he was overcome by the Holy Spirit, who told him to build a house of worship for him in his home. And that was very important because at the time there were no churches. Everything was frontier, and the only religious guidance that people got was from traveling circuit riding preachers. So Jacob built this chapel, and it's famous because on November 30th of 1810, Bishop Francis Asbury stayed the night here, and he preached here. And Bishop Asbury was sent by John Wesley in England to spread Methodism in the southern colonies. So for a number of years, Bishop Asbury traveled a circuit, and he depended on the people that he ministered to provide him with shelter and food, and then he would conduct whatever religious services needed to be conducted at the time. He was very good at writing in his journal, and so we know for sure that he was here on November 30th of 1810 because he talks about the grueling traveling that he had to do through Cataloochee over the mountains, and he came in at 9 o'clock at night at Father Shuck's, and he says, "What an awful day." And the next day he writes, "Last night I was strongly afflicted by pain. Live or die, I must ride." Bishop Francis Asbury would have worn a dark coat and a hat and carried all his belongings in a saddlebag as he rode his horse over the thousands and thousands of miles that he rode for a number of years. The Eliza Chapel Methodist Church began here in this chapel. Jacob Shook owned most of the acreage that is now Clyde, and he donated land for the Shook campground where people would come and bring their wagons, and the visiting circuit riding preachers would come to perform baptisms or weddings or whatever was needed. So After a period of time, they decided to build a structure on this campground. And first, it was a log cabin similar to this here. And then it was a frame church and ultimately this brick church, which was the Louisa Methodist Church for a number of years until it closed in 2020.
Wanted to explain this piece of artwork. We in Sacred Places, who granted us the money to hire a artist for weaving and looming and dyeing materials. Her name is Miranda Garby from Leicester. She created this piece of artwork to depict Francis Asbury's trip across Cataloochee on the night that he was headed here to this house to preach, and that he got lost. And so this is, and this was in the nighttime, and it was also very cold, as in November. So it's depicting him crossing the river with his horse, and you can tell he's a little bit cold. And then the mountains in the background. She took a lot of inspiration from the apron that's right here next to it, the colors that's in that apron, and the apron was actually made and woven out of linen by Mary Smathers. So the colors that are in that apron are the colors that she used in this piece. And the piece has been naturally dyed with botanical type dyes, with madder root and several other types of dyes. And then she wove it just like they would have woven it back in the early 1800s. So this piece we're very proud of, and we're very proud of the artist who depicted this.